Tonight we're diving into a time when your dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a gamble with death. Forget the visions of royal feasts and extravagant banquets. Medieval Europe wasn't serving up roasted turkey legs and turkey-laden tables. Nope. Think mouldy bread, mystery meats, and whatever wasn't too rotten to stomach. No forks, no hygiene, and absolutely no idea if what you were eating was food or the disease that would kill you. And for the poor, it wasn't just bad, it was a nightmare. So if you've got snacks by your side, maybe think twice before you take another bite. Wonder how people actually survived this culinary nightmare? Well, stick around. Before we dig in, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your world right now? I'm always curious which time zones are crazy enough to tackle this topic at midnight. Now, let's dim the lights, take a deep breath, and get ready to sink your teeth into the worst menu in European history. In the early centuries of medieval Europe, the staple of every meal, whether in a royal castle or a humble peasant hut, was bread. But not the kind of bread we know today, soft, pillowy, and fresh from the oven. Instead, bread during this period was hard, stale, and often served as little more than a vessel for soup or stew. Why? To understand the fate of medieval food, we must first explore the realities of survival during this era. Throughout the Middle Ages, agricultural practices were inefficient at best. Most farming was done with primitive tools and crop yields were low, with little to no margin for error. A single bad harvest could lead to famine. So, bread, made from wheat, rye or barley, became the basis of life, regardless of the quality of ingredients. But this isn't the worst of it. The bread often became stale quickly due to a lack of refrigeration, and the more ancient bread could have a sour, often mouldy taste. But despite these disadvantages, bread was a crucial part of life. It was used in every meal, soaking up the few watery stews peasants could afford, absorbing the little fat and protein they had available. What's even worse is that bread was often made with the same wheat and grains used to grow the next crop, meaning it was a continual cycle of crop-reliant diets with very little variety. And for the lower classes, their bread was more often than not filled with undesirable ingredients, such as chopped up peasants' remains, discarded grain, or grain that had been stored improperly and became infested with bugs. By the time this bread reached the table, it was far from appetizing. The question remains, how did people manage to live off such a bland, tasteless diet for centuries? As we continue our journey through the dismal world of medieval food, it becomes clear that bread was not just a meal, it was a lifeline. In fact, it was so vital to medieval society that its consumption affected everything from social structure to the survival of entire populations. Bread was life and often death. In towns and villages across Europe, bread served as a daily necessity. For the peasants, a slice of bread was a hard-earned prize after long hours of labour in the fields. It was eaten at every meal, soaked in soup or dipped in the thin stews that were the primary form of sustenance. This daily bread was cheap, though far from nutritious. However, it filled stomachs and provided the energy needed for work. But bread was also a mark of social status. Nobility and the wealthy would eat finer bread, made from the best wheat and often flavoured with spices. In contrast, the lower classes, those who worked the land, had to settle for bread made from darker grains like rye or barley, sometimes even mixed with chestnut flour. It wasn't uncommon for peasant bread to be filled with weeds, bark or other undesirable ingredients when food shortages or poor harvests occurred. One of the more striking aspects of this bread was the way it was prepared and stored. Bread wasn't baked every day. Instead, it was prepared in bulk, baked in large loaves, and then stored for weeks or even months at a time. The bread could become rock-hard, stale, and incredibly difficult to chew. The tougher the bread, the better it was for survival because it could withstand the passage of time and the elements. To soften the bread, medieval peasants had a special method. They would dip the hard loaves into soups or sauces, allowing the bread to absorb whatever little flavour could be mustered from the ingredients. It was not unusual for bread to be soaked in ale, making the meal a necessary but unpleasant combination of nourishment and endurance. But perhaps the most surprising fact about medieval bread is the use of bread soup. This dish consisted of old bread, usually stale and hard, that was dipped into a brothy soup made from vegetables or meat. The bread would soak up whatever liquid was available, making it the primary method of preserving food. It was a frugal way of utilising bread and soup, ensuring that no resources went to waste. However, this practice also meant that the bread lost any semblance of freshness or flavour, resulting in a taste that was nothing short of unpleasant. Peasants, with little access to vegetables, spices or fresh meats, had no choice but to rely on what they had: bread. For the rich, bread was a symbol of power and status, but for the poor, it was simply a matter of survival. This unappetizing form of sustenance was the primary food source for medieval society, from the smallest hamlet to the grandest castle. The most perplexing question remains: why did medieval society persist with this diet, accepting stale, mouldy bread as their main source of nutrition for so long? Was it a simple matter of lack of alternatives, or was there something deeper at play? After countless centuries of reliance on stale, hard bread, medieval Europe gradually moved toward a more varied and complex diet. But the legacy of this humble food staple cannot be overstated. It is said that the hardships endured by the medieval population led to a certain toughness and resilience, not just in the body but also in the psyche of the people. Bread, with all its unappetizing qualities, was what kept them alive through the harshest of times. Bread, though frequently bland and often unpleasant, symbolized endurance. The very idea of bread as a survival tool is fascinating. How something so simple, so seemingly unremarkable, could hold entire societies together for hundreds of years. Its presence on the table every day gave a sense of continuity and stability. Even during famines, bread was still a vital part of the diet, albeit with fewer nutrients. Even the worst of medieval bread was still bread, an unwavering constant amidst the uncertainty of medieval life. For centuries, bread was more than just food. It was a currency. There were taxes paid in bread, particularly in rural areas where grain was the most accessible form of trade. In some cases, entire armies were fed on bread, sometimes made from the poorest quality flour. Bread was also used in religious ceremonies. Christians in the medieval period were taught that bread was a symbol of life and divine providence, particularly in the form of communion, a tradition that, while spiritual, also echoed the importance of bread in daily life. Bread's role in sustaining populations goes beyond the medieval period, affecting the way society developed in subsequent centuries. Its significance laid the groundwork for the agricultural revolution, which would eventually lead to better farming techniques and the development of more diverse and nutritious diets. As more crops became available, such as potatoes and maize, bread recipes began to diversify. The hard, stale loaves of the past were replaced with lighter, softer and more palatable breads, though the simple loaves of the past still haunt the historical imagination. But still, even today, the legacy of medieval bread lives on. From the humble beginnings of wheat and barley loaves, we now have the variety of bread we see across the world today. But there is something haunting about the very idea of a food so foundational yet so unremarkable. The stale bread of medieval Europe, filled with the remnants of 1,000 years of struggle, paved the way for the global food culture we now enjoy, albeit without the same hardships. How much of the world's modern culinary traditions were influenced by the basic, often dreadful meal? In what ways does the survival instinct embedded in the medieval diet still resonate in today's global food practices? The story of medieval bread, with all its unappetizing history, reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. It wasn't just about the bread, but the people who survived on it. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. How history, no matter how dull or unappealing, has shaped the present in ways we often don't realize. The word fruit conjures up images of colourful, succulent apples, plump berries, and sweet peaches, foods we can easily find in grocery stores today. But in medieval Europe, fruit wasn't always as abundant or as delightful as we might think. The relationship between medieval society and fruit was complex, and most of the fruits that were common during this time are no longer part of our modern diet. To understand why fruits were so different back then, we need to look at the practicalities of medieval agriculture and the way it shaped the availability and consumption of fruits. Medieval fruit was often wild and unpredictable, grown more from necessity than enjoyment. Many of the fruits people ate were not the sweet, cultivated varieties we're used to today, but rather bitter, sour, or tough, often coming from trees that were wild or unsophisticatedly cultivated. There were no grocery store aisles filled with peaches, pineapples, and grapes. Instead, the fruits available to people were limited to apples, pears, plums, and cherries, many of which had a much more astringent taste than we experience today. Apples were the most common fruit, yet they were often not as sweet as the varieties we enjoy now. These apples were primarily grown for their preservation qualities, rather than their taste. They could be stored for long periods, making them an important food source through the colder months when fresh produce was scarce. Apples would be stewed, dried, or fermented into cider, a specialty in some regions of Europe. This was not for the faint-hearted, as it was a potent drink, nothing like the sweet wines we are familiar with today. Fruit trees were often found in monasteries, which were key centres for agriculture and food production. The monks who grew these fruits often did so as part of a larger plan to feed themselves and their communities. Orchards were carefully tended, but they weren't just about producing food for the monks, they were also used to demonstrate divine providence and grace. Fruits were symbols of fertility and the natural world's ability to provide. For a monk, cultivating fruit was not only a task of survival, but also an act of reverence, a way of honouring God's creations. However, the fruits they grew were often rather bland in comparison to what we expect today. Yet the cultivation and consumption of fruit weren't without challenges. The medieval diet was very dependent on seasonality, and fruits were no exception. In a world without refrigeration, once harvested, fruits had to be consumed quickly or preserved through drying, pickling, or fermenting. Fresh fruit was a rare luxury in winter months, and some fruits, like strawberries, simply couldn't survive the cold. But while most of the fruit consumed in medieval Europe was far from the sweet, juicy variety we're accustomed to, it was an essential part of their survival strategy. The question is, how did this limited variety of fruit evolve over time? And what role did it play in shaping the social and agricultural practices of the Middle Ages? The role of fruit in medieval Europe was not limited to being a mere food source. It was deeply intertwined with the practices of medieval medicine, preservation, and religious symbolism. Even though the fruits were not as flavourful or varied as we know today, their uses stretched far beyond the dining table. They were part of a larger, more holistic approach to health and survival, in a time when medicine was rudimentary at best and the natural world held profound significance. In medieval society, the distinction between food and medicine was far less clear-cut than it is today. Many fruits were believed to have medicinal properties and were often prescribed to treat a variety of ailments. Pears, for example, were known for their cooling properties and were often given to those suffering from fever or heat-related illnesses. The juice of the apple was also a common remedy for digestive problems, while plums were used to relieve constipation. Fruit was seen as both sustenance and a natural healing tool, often prescribed by monks or physicians who relied on natural remedies to treat everything from the common cold to more serious conditions. The preservation of fruit was also an art in itself. Medieval Europeans had no refrigeration, so they relied heavily on drying and fermenting to preserve fruits for the lean winter months. Apples, plums, and cherries were dried, often sliced and strung on ropes, or placed in baskets to be stored in cool, dry places. These dried fruits became an important part of the winter diet, added to porridge or stews to bring a bit of flavour and nutrition to otherwise bland meals. Fermentation was another crucial method of preservation. Many fruits were fermented into alcohol to keep them from spoiling. The most notable example is the making of cider from apples, which became a staple beverage, especially in Northern Europe. Fermented plums, pears, and even berries were turned into wines or meads. These alcoholic drinks not only provided some variety to the medieval diet, but were also essential in an age when clean drinking water was often hard to come by. The fermentation process helped kill harmful bacteria, making these drinks safer to consume than water from rivers or wells. But even beyond the practical considerations of food preservation and medicinal uses, fruit in the medieval period carried deep religious symbolism. The apple, for instance, was famously linked to the Garden of Eden and, by extension, to the fall of mankind. For Christians in the medieval period, fruit was a reminder of humanity's lost innocence. Many monasteries and abbeys cultivated orchards, and these fruit trees were not just a source of sustenance, they were seen as sacred. In many cases, the care and cultivation of fruit trees were part of the monks' devotion, symbolizing the cultivation of spiritual fruitfulness in their own lives. The importance of fruit in medieval society extended beyond practical needs to spiritual and cultural symbolism. But the limitations of available fruits meant that the medieval diet was much more austere than our modern one, relying on whatever fruits could survive the harsh climate and poor agricultural practices of the time. Even so, the medieval reliance on fruit for both food and medicine revealed a deep connection to nature, a relationship that would later influence the agricultural revolutions of the Renaissance and beyond. Yet despite the significance fruit held, it wasn't enough to sustain medieval society on its own. The question remains, how did the need for a more varied and nutritious diet push medieval Europeans to innovate and diversify their food practices in the centuries that followed? As medieval Europe slowly transitioned into the Renaissance period, the way people approached food began to change dramatically. One of the most important factors in this evolution was the advancement of agricultural practices, which led to better cultivation methods and the introduction of new, more diverse foods into the European diet. This period saw the beginnings of more sophisticated farming techniques, which in turn allowed for better fruit varieties to be cultivated, setting the stage for a broader array of flavours, textures, and nutrients. By the late medieval period, fruit cultivation began to shift from the wild, erratic varieties grown by monks and peasants to more intentional and controlled farming methods. The monks who had been the main cultivators of fruit started to experiment with different techniques of grafting and planting. This meant that fruit trees, like apples and pears, were no longer limited to the wild types, but could now be cultivated in a variety of forms. The ability to graft and cross-pollinate fruits led to better quality fruit that was not only sweeter, but more resistant to diseases and pests. For the first time in centuries, fruit trees were being planted for the express purpose of increasing the yield of edible fruit, rather than simply as a means of food preservation or medicinal use. This shift toward better fruit farming was particularly noticeable in regions with favourable climates, such as southern France and Spain and Italy. These areas saw an explosion of fruit varieties, and more importantly, the introduction of fruits that had been previously unknown to Europeans. One of the most important introductions during this time was the arrival of citrus fruits from the Middle East and North Africa. Through trade routes established during the Crusades, Mediterranean societies gained access to lemons, oranges, and limes. The bitter flavour of these fruits was initially unfamiliar to Europeans, but they soon became prized for their ability to help preserve food and their potential medicinal properties. Citrus fruits became symbolic of luxury, and their presence in the royal courts of Europe was a clear sign of wealth and refinement. Another key development was the rise of the fruit orchard as a business enterprise. Wealthier landowners, both in urban and rural areas, began to treat fruit cultivation as a serious agricultural pursuit. These orchards were no longer just a supplement to a diet of bread and ale. They became specialised in producing a variety of fruits, which could be sold at markets, transported over long distances, or even exported to other countries. The development of fruit trade in Europe had a profound effect on the diet of ordinary people, and for the first time in history, fruits like peaches, apricots, and cherries were becoming more accessible, especially to the growing middle class. This new variety of fruit, alongside better farming methods, began to alter the diet of Europeans, bringing a shift in culinary practices. The more refined and diverse types of fruit cultivated in the Renaissance period began to appear in the royal courts, in the diets of the aristocracy, and eventually over time in the homes of ordinary people. Fruit began to be seen as something more than a survival food. It became a symbol of abundance and luxury. For example, sugar was used more frequently in the preparation of fruits, making jams, compotes, and preserves more widespread. However, this shift was not universal. Even as fruit began to become more accessible in the late medieval period, it was still a relatively small part of the everyday diet for most peasants. Bread, dairy, and meat still dominated the lower classes' meals, and fruit, while more plentiful, remained a luxury. Pineapples, and even exotic fruits from the Americas, would revolutionize European diets in the centuries that followed. The days of bitter, astringent apples and pears were slowly becoming a distant memory, as fruit began to find its place in the heart of European cuisine. Looking back, the evolution of fruit in Europe is not just a story of agriculture, it's a tale of innovation, trade, and adaptation. Medieval fruit may have been less sweet and more utilitarian, but it paved the way for the vast diversity of fruit we enjoy today. The ingenuity of medieval farmers and the exchange of goods across continents transformed fruit from a basic survival food into the delicious, varied component of modern diets. The question remains, however, how much of our modern food system, including the fruit we take for granted, can be traced back to those early experimental days of cultivation in medieval Europe? The fruits we eat today, from apples to citrus, have rich, layered histories, each one with its own story of survival, change, and cultural exchange. How did these fruits shape the global food market as we know it today? In the medieval period, a hearty bowl of soup or stew was often the highlight of a meal. These humble dishes, made from whatever ingredients could be gathered or scavenged, were not just filling, they were essential to the survival of the European population. Stews, broths, and soups were the backbone of medieval food, especially for the lower classes. But while they may seem simple, these meals held a deeper significance, both nutritionally and socially, and played a critical role in the survival of medieval Europe's population. The ingredients for these soups were as basic as the methods for preparing them. Most medieval stews consisted of a combination of grains, vegetables, and some form of protein. Meat, if available, was a luxury, and the poor often had to make do with bones, scraps, or salted fish. The core of the stew was usually a grain like barley, oats, or rye, which helped thicken the soup and make it more filling. These grains were cheap, widely available, and could be grown in abundance, making them the perfect staple for the medieval diet. Vegetables such as cabbage, leeks, onions, carrots, and peas were commonly used in these stews. These vegetables were often the only source of vitamins and minerals for the peasants, as they were relatively cheap to grow and were a great addition to soups that could simmer for hours. Legumes, particularly beans and lentils, were another common addition, providing the much-needed protein in a diet that lacked meat for the majority of the population. For the wealthy, the soups were a bit more elaborate, often containing beef mutton or game meats like venison, wild boar. Medieval soups was part of their genius. The long cooking times allowed the flavours to meld together, and even the most basic ingredients could be transformed into a flavourful, nutritious meal. But the importance of soup went beyond the kitchen. It had cultural and social significance too. In a society where food was often scarce, soup was a meal that could stretch to feed large families, and sometimes entire communities. It became a symbol of communal survival. Stews also had practical uses. They were often prepared in large cauldrons over an open fire, making them ideal for the medieval household. Leftovers could be stored for the next day, or even the day after, meaning that one large pot of stew could last for several meals. The pot would often be replenished throughout the day, with more water and ingredients added as needed. This made stews an efficient, low-maintenance meal for those living in difficult circumstances. The real question, however, is how did such a simple dish, so far removed from the fine dining we associate with food today, become the cornerstone of medieval life? Was it simply a matter of necessity, or did the humble stew hold some deeper significance in the medieval worldview? The reliance on stew and broth reveals much about the harsh realities of survival in the Middle Ages and how creativity in the kitchen was a matter of life and death. As we continue to explore the crucial role of soup and stew in medieval Europe, it's essential to understand the more than just the sustenance it provided. Soup wasn't merely a meal, it was a way of life. In an era without antibiotics, refrigeration or modern medicine, broths and soups were vital for survival. These simple dishes provided more than just food. They were a means of staying healthy in an environment that was often hostile to human life. Broths and soups in medieval Europe were a cornerstone of the diet, particularly for the poor, for one key reason. They provided a concentrated source of nutrition in a world where food was scarce and access to fresh produce was limited. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was an ever-present concern, and the preservation of nutrients was paramount. Long-simmered soups allowed for the extraction of nutrients from bones, scraps of meat, vegetables, and grains that would otherwise go unused. For the medieval lower class, who were often unable to afford fresh meat or high-quality produce, broth became a crucial means of getting necessary nutrients. Bone broths, which were simmered for hours or even days, contained essential minerals like calcium and magnesium, which are vital for bone and overall health. Additionally, the slow simmering process allowed the collagen from bones and connective tissue to break down into gelatin, a substance that helped maintain skin and joint health. These broths were often consumed daily and helped maintain strength and endurance for long, grueling labour. Legumes like beans, lentils and peas, when added to these broths, contributed much needed protein for the body. While the meat in medieval diets was often tough, fatty or rare, legumes offered a more consistent and affordable source of protein, and they were regularly included in soups. Peasants and lower classes often relied on these simple yet vital foods, as they could be grown easily in their own gardens and could stretch further than meat, feeding many people from a single pot. Herbs and spices too were commonly added to soups, not just for flavour, but also for medicinal purposes. In medieval times, the line between food and medicine was often blurred, and soups were often seen as healing elixirs. Garlic, onions, leeks, and mustard were common ingredients, as they were believed to have healing properties. Garlic in particular was considered a powerful remedy for a variety of ailments, from infections to digestive issues. Leeks and onions were thought to promote good health, and mustard was believed to aid in digestion and prevent the build-up of phlegm, a common problem in medieval society. For the nobility, soup served as a way to demonstrate wealth and sophistication, but it also held practical health benefits. Wealthier households would use more expensive meats and exotic spices, creating luxurious broths. But even for the rich, the benefits of broth were clear. Rich, meaty soups made from game meats or fish were often consumed as a way to ensuring that food was always on hand, even when fresh produce was unavailable. In a world where food security was never guaranteed, the ability to rely on a simple, nutritious dish like soup was a key component in the endurance of medieval societies. However, the widespread use of broth and soup begs the question, did the medieval reliance on such simple dishes reflect a broader trend in the period, one marked by scarcity and a lack of variety? Or was it a strategic response to a challenging environment? Were soups simply a necessity, or was there something more profound about the way these meals shaped medieval society? As we conclude our exploration of medieval soups and their role in the survival and sustenance of European society, it becomes clear that the legacy of these simple, hearty meals stretches far beyond the Middle Ages. The importance of soups, broths, and stews in medieval diets had profound effects on culinary practices in Europe and eventually the world. These meals, though humble and seemingly unremarkable, shaped not only the way food was prepared and consumed in the medieval period, but also left a lasting influence on the evolution of European cuisine. The medieval soup, in its most basic form, is still alive in many cultures today. Broths, stews, and soups have endured across centuries, passed down through generations, and transformed into the diverse array of soups we now enjoy worldwide. From the French onion soup to the British beef stew, and even the Italian minestrone, many of these dishes can trace their roots back to the types of meals that medieval Europeans ate for survival. In many ways, the medieval stew laid the groundwork for what we now think of as comfort food, a simple, nourishing dish that can feed a family or community. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval soups is the concept of utilising every part of an ingredient, whether it's meat, bones, vegetables or grains. The practice of making the most of what you have became not just an economic necessity, but a cultural one. In today's world, where food waste is a growing concern, this practice continues to inspire modern chefs and home cooks alike. The idea of transforming leftover scraps into something delicious and nutritious is not only resourceful but also environmentally sustainable. This method of cooking can be seen in modern bone broths, stocks, and slow-cooked stews, which are becoming increasingly popular as people rediscover the value of cooking with whole, unprocessed ingredients. Medieval broths were also foundational in the development of modern soups, which today form a significant part of many people's daily diets. Whether it's a classic chicken soup for the sick, a rich, hearty beef stew after a long day, or a warming vegetable broth to keep the winter chills at bay, these meals continue to evoke feelings of comfort, community and nourishment. The cultural importance of soups, especially in family and communal settings, speaks to their historical significance. In the Middle Ages, a bowl of soup wasn't just food, it was a means of survival and a reflection of the values of the time, resourcefulness, community and care. Furthermore, the medieval legacy of soup extends beyond Europe. As trade routes opened up and cultures began to blend, the exchange of culinary techniques and ingredients played a significant role in shaping global food traditions. The use of spices, herbs, and the practice of slow cooking travelled from the kitchens of medieval Europe to the tables of Asia, the Americas, and beyond. This cross-cultural exchange helped spread the principles of cooking with broths and stews, enriching global cuisine with new flavours, textures, and methods. However, even with all these innovations, it's important to remember that medieval soups were born out of necessity. The reliance on soups as a primary form of nourishment reflects the scarcity of food and the harsh realities of the time. The soups that medieval peasants ate were often made with the most basic, affordable ingredients: root vegetables, legumes, and scraps of meat. They were filling, sustaining, and inexpensive, but also reflective of the challenges that came with living in an era where food production was unpredictable and survival was never guaranteed. Despite these humble beginnings, soup grew into something more. It became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the creativity and ingenuity of people who made the best of what they had. So, as we sit down to a bowl of soup today, it's worth reflecting on the centuries of culinary history that brought this simple dish into our kitchens. From the medieval peasants who relied on it for survival to the chefs who now turn it into gourmet dishes, soup has transcended its humble beginnings. It is a reminder that even in the most challenging of times, humans have the ability to adapt, create, and endure. The next time you enjoy a bowl of soup, whether it's a classic chicken noodle or a rich, savoury stew, remember that you're partaking in a culinary tradition that has sustained civilizations for centuries. The question remains, though, how much of today's culinary innovation can be traced back to the fundamental techniques and practices that evolved out of medieval necessity? And what does this enduring tradition say about the human spirit's capacity to thrive, no matter how harsh the environment? In medieval Europe, food was not just a matter of survival, it was also an expression of power, wealth, and status. The grand banquets held in castles and palaces were spectacles of excess, with tables piled high with meats, fruits, and exotic spices. These feasts were not only an opportunity to display one's wealth, but also a tool for cementing political alliances, showcasing nobility, and demonstrating the host's control over his domain. But while these feasts were magnificent displays of abundance, they were also deeply dangerous. The excesses of medieval feasts, combined with poor food handling and preparation practices, made them breeding grounds for disease and death. The food at medieval feasts was often rich and opulent, designed to dazzle and overwhelm the guests. The meat was the centerpiece of these banquets. with roasted boar, venison, wild fowl, and beef making regular appearances. These meats were often seasoned with heavy doses of salt, sugar, and spices, both to preserve the food and to add exotic flavours. Spices, which were imported from Asia and the Middle East, became the ultimate symbol of wealth, with pepper, saffron, and cinnamon being used generously. But these feasts were not just about luxury. They were also an opportunity to demonstrate political power. Rulers would invite their vassals, allies, and rivals to these elaborate banquets as a way of asserting their dominance. The feast became a stage for negotiations, a place where political deals were struck, and where the subtle messages of loyalty and power were communicated through the abundance of food on display. A lavish feast could send a powerful message about the wealth and strength of the host, while a more modest banquet might be interpreted as a sign of weakness. Despite the grandeur of these feasts, there was a dark side. The wealth that supported these extravagant gatherings often came at the expense of the common people, whose lives were dominated by poverty and hunger. The disparity between the sumptuous feasts of the rich and the meagre meals of the peasantry was stark, and it added to the social tensions that defined medieval society. But perhaps the most deadly aspect of these feasts was the food itself. Without refrigeration or modern preservation methods, meat would often spoil before it was cooked. The heavy use of salt and spices was as much about preservation as it was about flavour. However, even with these methods, food poisoning and outbreaks of disease were common at these gatherings. The consumption of tainted meat, improperly handled food, or contaminated water could lead to a swift and deadly illness, sometimes taking down entire noble families or courts in a matter of days. One of the most infamous cases of a deadly feast occurred in 1410, when a banquet held by the Archbishop of Canterbury was responsible for the death of several prominent guests. The culprit, a dish made from a large roasted boar that had been poorly cooked and was contaminated with botulism. Several guests who partook in the feast fell ill, and many died within hours of eating. The tragic event became a cautionary tale about the dangers of feasting without proper knowledge of food preservation and preparation. But it wasn't just spoiled meat that posed a threat. The medieval aristocracy also consumed large amounts of sugar, especially in the form of pastries and sweet dishes. Sugar was rare and expensive, and its use in food was a clear marker of status. However, excessive sugar consumption led to a variety of health problems, from tooth decay to diabetes, and may have contributed to the overall decline in health among the nobility. The opulent feasts that were meant to signal power and prestige were, in some cases, contributing to the very downfall of the elites who hosted them. As medieval feasts became more extravagant, so did the risks associated with them. With no understanding of germs, bacteria, or proper food safety, the potential for death at a feast was not just a rare accident, it was a very real risk. For the rich and powerful, the same lavish banquets that displayed their wealth and power were also the most likely to lead to their undoing. The very foods that were meant to impress and indulge could just as easily become weapons of destruction. The real question remains, however, how could the very feasts meant to display wealth and power also end in tragedy? How did the medieval obsession with excess and luxury ultimately contribute to their own vulnerability? And what does this tell us about the balance between indulgence and practicality in the pursuit of power? As we continue our exploration of the deadly feasts of medieval Europe, it becomes evident that the lavish displays of food were not only about indulgence, but also ignorance. The lack of understanding of food safety, preservation, and hygiene led to numerous tragedies that swept through medieval courts and noble households. Without refrigeration or the knowledge we have today about bacteria and pathogens, medieval people were living in a precarious relationship with their food, unaware that the very meals they celebrated could become deadly. The absence of modern preservation methods made food spoilage a constant problem. The meat served at feasts was often slaughtered far in advance, especially in times of war or when access to fresh food was limited. Preserving meat required salting, smoking, or drying, but these methods were not foolproof. Even the best-intentioned attempts at preserving food could fall short, and improper storage would lead to food that was not only unpalatable but also dangerous. meats like pork, venison, and wildfowl were particularly vulnerable to spoilage. The wealthy, who could afford the luxury of exotic game meat, were often unaware of the risks they were taking when consuming meat that had been poorly preserved. Because the medieval understanding of foodborne illness was virtually non-existent, there was no way to know that eating spoiled or contaminated meat could lead to deadly diseases, such as botulism or salmonella. One of the most common and most deadly illnesses associated with spoiled food was food poisoning. The symptoms of food poisoning were often indistinguishable from other diseases, and medieval people had no way of distinguishing between a natural illness and one caused by spoiled food. A large portion of the nobility, particularly at banquets, consumed meats that were served too late after slaughter, and by the time it reached the table, the meat was already spoiled. This was often masked by heavy spices, sauces, and excessive salt, which hid the staleness and sourness of the food, but did nothing to prevent the harmful bacteria from wreaking havoc on the digestive system. For instance, during one notorious feast in 1526, a banquet in the court of King Henry VIII of England ended tragically when multiple guests became severely ill after eating spoiled venison that had not been properly stored. The entire court was affected, and several members of the royal household had to be quarantined due to the severity of the food poisoning. At the time, the cause of the illness was largely unknown, but today we know that consuming improperly stored meat can lead to the growth of bacteria such as Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism, a life-threatening condition. But it wasn't just meat that posed a risk. Fish too was prone to rapid spoilage. Medieval seafood, particularly salt-preserved fish like herring, had to be handled carefully to avoid bacterial contamination. This, combined with the absence of refrigeration, meant that fish dishes served at feasts were often at the mercy of how quickly they had been caught, salted, and transported. Even the freshest of fish could spoil quickly if it was not consumed right after being caught, and without knowledge of bacteria or the ways food could spoil, feasts were often the site of mass illness. Another contributing factor to foodborne illness in medieval feasts was the lack of proper hygiene. The medieval kitchen, while often located in the castle or manor, was not the cleanest place. Cooking utensils and dishes were frequently reused without proper cleaning, and there was no way of ensuring that food was prepared under sanitary conditions. Water used for cooking and cleaning was often sourced from rivers or wells, which could easily be contaminated by waste or runoff. This lack of hygiene was exacerbated by the fact that medieval kitchens were often hot, cramped, and dark, creating an environment that was ripe for contamination. This absence of hygiene extended to the servants who prepared the food. While the nobility enjoyed lavish feasts, the kitchen staff, often working long hours under stressful conditions, might not have had the luxury of following the same standards of cleanliness that we expect today. The likelihood of contamination from handling, storage, and preparation made feasts highly dangerous, especially for those who had no choice but to partake in the meals prepared for them. Yet despite the many dangers, feasts continued to be a staple of medieval society. Even the threat of death by food poisoning or spoiled meat could not diminish the prestige of hosting or attending these extravagant gatherings. This dedication to excess, luxury, and indulgence, often at the cost of health and safety, reflected the broader mindset of medieval elites, that their wealth and power were above the realities of daily life. The very feasts meant to celebrate life and power were, ironically, the ones most likely to end in tragedy. But this raises an important question. How did this relationship between food and risk shape medieval society's view of wealth, power, and the value of life? Was the pursuit of opulence worth the constant risk of death? Or were these feasts a demonstration of how deeply the medieval elite were disconnected from the realities of their own mortality? As we reach the conclusion of our examination of the deadly feasts of medieval Europe, we must consider how these grand gatherings, full of both luxury and risk, began to fall out of favour, and how the food practices that developed from these early banquets influenced modern culinary traditions. Over time, the extravagance of medieval feasts and the dangers associated with food poisoning began to make people reconsider their eating habits. With the growth of knowledge in medicine, hygiene, and food preservation, the excessive, dangerous feasts of the medieval period gradually gave way to more regulated, safer and healthier food practices. One of the primary catalysts for the decline of the medieval feast was the growing awareness of hygiene and food safety in the early modern period. As Europe entered the Renaissance and beyond, significant strides were made in understanding sanitation, the spread of diseases, and the importance of food preservation. The use of salt and spices to preserve food began to be regulated more carefully, and the medieval reliance on spoiled and poorly prepared meats started to decline. As trade routes expanded and global exploration brought new ingredients and preservation methods, Europeans began to adopt more sophisticated techniques of food handling and cooking. The introduction of refrigeration and the improvement of food storage methods were transformative for the culinary world. While refrigeration wouldn't become widely accessible until the 19th century, the concept of keeping perishable items cool started to emerge with the development of ice houses and later mechanical cooling systems. This shift in food preservation practices allowed for fresher ingredients to be used in cooking, reducing the risk of foodborne illnesses caused by spoilage. The once prevalent practice of serving large quantities of preserved, salted and dried meats became less common, as it was no longer necessary to rely on such methods to keep food from spoiling. Moreover, the rise of medical knowledge and the understanding of foodborne pathogens led to a shift in attitudes toward food preparation. Advances in science, such as the discovery of bacteria and the development of germ theory, had a profound impact on how food was viewed and handled. During the medieval period, feasts were often enjoyed without any thought to the bacteria or pathogens lurking in improperly prepared food. But as the centuries progressed, more emphasis was placed on cleanliness, food hygiene, and proper cooking techniques. By the 16th century, cooks in royal courts and noble households began to adopt more hygienic practices. Kitchens were relocated to more sanitary environments, and there was a stronger emphasis on the proper handling of meat and produce. Additionally, the increased availability of fruits and vegetables, particularly after the agricultural revolution, meant that meals became more balanced and nutritious. With access to a wider variety of food, the all-meat, high-fat feasts that characterized the medieval period gradually transformed into more health-conscious meals, incorporating a greater variety of vegetables and less reliance on excessive meats. The fall of the medieval feast also coincided with the rise of social and political changes that began to reshape how food was consumed in Europe. The more extravagant feasts began to be seen as out of touch with the needs of the common people. As revolutions and social movements gained traction, there was an increased desire for a more egalitarian distribution of wealth and resources. The extravagant feasts of the nobility were no longer seen as a reflection of prosperity, but as a symbol of excess and inequality. The changing social landscape led associated with spoiled food and excessive indulgence have been reduced through advances in food science. The celebratory nature of a feast remains a key part of how we come together to mark important events. Additionally, the concept of preserving food for long periods has evolved into the modern practice of canning, freezing, and vacuum sealing. These methods, combined with refrigeration and more advanced technology, have made food preservation safer and more efficient than ever before. The reliance on salt and spices as preservatives has been replaced with modern techniques that maintain the flavour and nutritional value of food without the same health risks. But even as we enjoy the benefits of these advancements, it's important to remember the lessons of the medieval feast. The extravagant meals that once symbolised power and wealth were, in many ways, a product of ignorance and excess. They remind us that food, while essential to life, must be treated with respect, knowledge, and care. The fall of these dangerous feasts and the rise of safer, healthier food practices are a testament to humanity's ability to adapt and improve over time. As we look to the future of food, we must ask ourselves, how can we ensure that the lessons learned from the deadly feasts of the past continue to guide us? In a world where food security, sustainability, and health are growing concerns, it's vital that we reflect on the mistakes of history while working to create a more equitable and sustainable food system for the generations to come. Medieval hunting was not simply a recreational pastime, it was a practice deeply rooted in the survival of the nobility and in their ability to showcase power, control, and wealth. The hunt, while seemingly an elegant and noble activity, was fraught with danger, not just for the hunted animals, but for the hunters themselves. During this time, hunting was an essential part of medieval life, especially for the aristocracy, who depended on it both for food and for social status. However, hunting also presented hidden risks and often had dark consequences for both the participants and the animals involved. In the medieval period, hunting was wild boar, or even birds of prey, was considered a way to demonstrate one's superiority over nature and over other men. The hunt itself was often an elaborate and dangerous event. Hunting parties would be large and filled with nobility, servants, and trained hounds. The method of hunting was brutal. For large animals like deer and boar, the hunt could last for days, with hunters and their dogs chasing their prey through dense forests. The hunt was both thrilling and perilous. The animals were not easy prey, and hunting them required great skill. Wild boar in particular was dangerous to hunt because of its ferocity. A single boar could easily kill or seriously injure a hunter, and there were numerous accounts of hunters being gored by these powerful animals. Deer too could be deadly, especially when cornered, and the risk of injury from a stag's sharp antlers was high. While the hunt was often a display of aristocratic dominance, it also had a dark side. The hunting grounds were often vast, and the aristocracy claimed ownership of large swathes of land for this purpose. The land on which these hunts took place was often taken from commoners, who were pushed off their ancestral land to make way for the elite's desire for leisure and game. The poor were excluded from hunting rights and were left with fewer resources, as the land that could have been used for farming was turned into hunting grounds for the privileged. This growing division between the haves and the have-nots was one of the factors that fueled social unrest in the medieval period. Hunting also had an impact on the ecosystem itself. The practice of hunting large animals in vast quantities led to the overhunting of certain species, contributing to their decline. Some species, like the wild boar and the European aurochs, a species of wild cattle, were hunted to near extinction during the medieval period due to the demands of the hunt. The consequences of such unchecked hunting were far-reaching not only for the animals but for the stability of the ecosystems they inhabited. Yet beyond the physical dangers and the ecological impact, hunting also had hidden moral and ethical implications. The act of killing animals, often just for sport, was a luxury that most common people could not afford, and it was an exercise in excess that reflected the growing inequalities between the classes. For the common folk, watching a nobleman or a king hunt while they struggled to survive was a bitter reminder of the disparity in wealth and power. As the hunt continued to thrive as an elite activity, it became a central part of medieval culture, with some of the most lavish feasts being held in honour of successful hunts. Large quantities of meat from the animals hunted were often served at these feasts, further reinforcing the social divide and the role of hunting as a symbol of aristocratic power. However, the dark side of medieval hunting was not limited to the environment or the commoners. It also took a toll on the hunters themselves. The risks involved in the hunt, coupled with the brutal nature of medieval weaponry, meant that many nobles were injured or killed during hunting expeditions. The dangers of hunting became so notorious that by the late medieval period, laws were put in place to regulate hunting and restrict the types of animals that could be hunted and the areas where hunts could take place. These regulations were largely in response to the growing concerns over safety, but they also reflected the changing attitudes toward the practice. Yet despite these regulations, hunting continued to be a symbol of nobility and power for centuries to come. It was not just a means of obtaining food, it was a way for the elite to maintain their control over land, resources, and people. As the centuries went on, hunting slowly began to transition into more structured and regulated forms, such as game reserves and private hunting clubs. These changes ultimately led to the creation of modern hunting practices, though the legacy of medieval hunting lives on in the culture of hunting and its connection to wealth and power. The question remains, however, Was the thrill of the medieval hunt worth the ecological damage, the dangers, and the social inequalities it perpetuated? And in what ways did the practice of hunting become more than just a sport, but a symbol of aristocratic control and excess? As we continue to examine the dark side of medieval hunting, we must delve into the ethical and societal implications of this practice. While hunting was undeniably a central aspect of medieval life for the aristocracy, it also reflected deeper, more troubling values about the relationship between humans, nature, and social hierarchy. For the nobility, the act of hunting was more than just a means of obtaining food. It was a display of power, wealth, and dominion over both animals and people. The ethics of hunting in the medieval period were rooted in a culture of excess, exploitation, and inequality, and the very nature of the hunt served as a stark reminder of the deep divisions in medieval society. At the heart of the medieval hunting system was the idea of rights. The right to hunt on one's land and the right to take certain animals for sport or food. These rights were strictly reserved for the nobility, with peasants and commoners being excluded from the privilege of hunting. The ownership of hunting grounds was, therefore, a sign of aristocratic power, and hunting became an activity that reinforced the social and political hierarchy. Those with the most land were not just wealthy landowners, they were also the ones who controlled the animals within those lands, and their right to hunt was legally protected and upheld by the laws of the time. The exclusion of commoners from hunting rights had profound social and economic implications. The peasants, who worked the land and often lived in close for the nobility, a form of leisure, but it was also a display of their dominance over the common people. The hunt was about acquiring food. It was about showing that the hunters had the power to take whatever they desired from the land, no matter the consequences for the people who lived on it. The nobility's ability to hunt large game, deer, wild boar, and other exotic animals reinforced the idea that they were above the law and had the right to claim dominion over all aspects of nature. This sense of entitlement was central to the medieval aristocracy's self-image and the way they viewed their place in the world. At the same time, the medieval hunt was also a violent, bloodthirsty affair. The animals were often killed in brutal ways, with the hunters employing sharp weapons like swords, spears and arrows to bring down their prey. Hunting could be a bloody dangerous sport, and it was not uncommon for the hunters themselves to be injured or even killed during these expeditions. The hunt was not just a demonstration of power over nature, but also of the hunter's own ability to control life and death. For the nobility, the hunt was an expression of their superiority, an opportunity to prove that they had mastered the natural world. However, the ethics of hunting were questioned even during the medieval period. Many religious leaders condemned the act of hunting as morally reprehensible. The church in particular saw hunting as an act of indulgence and wastefulness. The idea that hunting for sport was acceptable while the poor struggled to survive raised ethical concerns. Some clergy members viewed hunting as a form of vanity and a reflection of the greed and excess that plagued the aristocracy. They also pointed to the hypocrisy of hunting for leisure, while the same lands were often poorly managed for agricultural purposes, leading to food scarcity for the common people. Furthermore, the environmental impact of hunting was another ethical consideration. Overhunting led to the depletion of animal populations, which had long-lasting effects on the ecosystems. Many species, such as the wild boar and the European aurochs, were hunted to the brink of extinction. The disregard for sustainability in hunting practices contributed to the collapse of animal populations and ultimately altered the natural balance of the medieval landscape. While the nobility revelled in their ability to hunt with impunity, the ecological consequences of their actions were beginning to emerge. By the late medieval period, the pressures of overhunting and environmental degradation began to take their toll. The once abundant forests and game reserves that had sustained the aristocracy were being depleted, and the consequences of this were felt not only by the animals, but also by the people. In response to these growing concerns, laws were enacted to regulate hunting, particularly to prevent the overhunting of certain species, and to restrict hunting practices to protect the environment. These laws, known as forest laws, were designed to protect game animals, regulate hunting methods, and prevent deforestation. However, these laws were often selectively enforced, and their primary beneficiaries were still the nobility, who had the power to shape them to their advantage. Despite these regulatory efforts, the moral and ethical dilemmas surrounding medieval hunting persisted. The hunt remained a symbol of privilege, control, and dominance over both nature and society. The question remains, did that aristocracy ever truly recognise the harm they caused, both to the environment and to the people, in their pursuit of leisure and sport? And what role did the growing awareness of ecological destruction and social inequality play in the eventual transformation of hunting practices in later centuries? As the centuries progressed, the medieval practice of hunting began to evolve, both socially and legally. The once proud tradition, deeply intertwined with aristocratic privilege, gradually became more regulated, and the excesses that defined medieval hunting practices started to give way to modern hunting laws and wildlife conservation. This shift was not just a result of the growing awareness of environmental and social issues, but also a consequence of the changing political landscape and the rise of new economic systems. By the late medieval period, social tensions were mounting. The inequalities between the elite and the common folk had reached a breaking point, particularly as the disparity between the rich and poor became more pronounced. The nobility's extravagant hunts, which were often marked by excess and waste, became symbols of the aristocracy's disregard for the welfare of the peasantry. The peasantry, who were prohibited from hunting and often faced dire food shortages, were increasingly resentful of the lavish feasts and abundant game enjoyed by the elite. This resentment eventually led to uprisings, with common people demanding more rights and access to resources, including hunting grounds. In response to these growing tensions, monarchs and rulers began to implement more stringent hunting regulations. The so-called forest laws, which had been in place since the Norman conquest of England in the 11th century, became more restrictive in the late medieval period. These laws were designed to protect hunting grounds, restrict hunting practices, and limit the types of animals that could be killed. However, they also served to further entrench the privileges of the nobility. The forest laws were primarily enforced for the benefit of the aristocracy, and peasants who hunted without permission were often punished harshly, facing fines, imprisonment, or even execution. The very same laws that were meant to protect the game also served to keep power in the hands of the elite. Despite these measures, the environmental toll of overhunting began to become more apparent. Many species, such as the wild boar and the European aurochs, were hunted to extinction or near extinction. As hunting became less about necessity and more about luxury, the depletion of wildlife was inevitable. Overhunting contributed to the destabilization of ecosystems, which had long-term effects on biodiversity. The depletion of forests, driven in part by the need for more hunting grounds, also contributed to the erosion of natural habitats. The medieval obsession with hunting for sport, without consideration for the long-term consequences, left a lasting scar on the natural world. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, attitudes toward hunting were shifting. The rise of humanism and the increasing emphasis on knowledge and scientific inquiry brought new perspectives on nature and the environment. The excesses of the medieval hunt were being questioned, and hunting began to take on a more regulated and sustainable form. While the elite continued to hunt for sport, the idea of preserving wildlife and ensuring that hunting was conducted in a responsible manner started to gain traction. The first wildlife preservation efforts, such as the establishment of game reserves, emerged during this time, setting the foundation for modern conservation efforts. In the centuries that followed, hunting practices continued to evolve. As firearms became more widely available in the early modern period, hunting changed from the dangerous physical pursuit it had been in the medieval era to a more controlled and structured activity. The emergence of hunting as a sport rather than a means of survival marked a significant departure from the past. Hunting became more formalized, with clubs and societies dedicated to preserving game and promoting ethical hunting practices. The modern legacy of medieval hunting is complex. On one hand, hunting continues to be a popular activity, enjoyed by millions of people around the world. It has been romanticised in literature and film, often seen as a noble pursuit or a way to connect with nature. However, hunting practices today are subject to far stricter regulations and are often tied to wildlife conservation efforts. The lessons learned from medieval hunting, the importance of sustainability, respect for wildlife and ethical considerations, have shaped the way we approach hunting and wildlife management today. At the same time, the legacy of medieval hunting also reminds us of the dangers of unchecked power, excess, and the exploitation of both people and animals. The aristocratic hunting practices of the past, which were so entwined with social inequality and environmental degradation, serve as a cautionary tale. They highlight the dangers of treating nature and wildlife as commodities to be used for personal gain without consideration for the long-term consequences. Today, as we face pressing environmental challenges, including the loss of biodiversity and the depletion of natural resources, the lessons of the past are more relevant than ever. Modern conservation efforts, which focus on protecting endangered species and preserving habitats, are a direct response to the mistakes made during the medieval period. The shift from excessive hunting to sustainable wildlife management is a reflection of a growing recognition that our relationship with nature must be one of stewardship, not exploitation. The final question remains: how can we ensure that the mistakes of the past, particularly those related to hunting and the treatment of wildlife, are not repeated in our modern world? What role does our understanding of history play in shaping our attitudes toward conservation and sustainable practices in the future? The medieval period was marked by countless hardships, but none were as devastating as the arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century. This plague, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, claimed the lives of an estimated one-third of the continent's population, leaving entire villages abandoned and cities in chaos. The Black Death was not just a medical crisis, it was a social and economic catastrophe that fundamentally altered the course of history. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the Black Death was the complete inadequacy of medieval medicine in responding to the pandemic. Medieval Europe was ill-equipped to deal with the plague, both in terms of medical knowledge and infrastructure. The medical understanding of the time was primitive, and many of the treatments used to combat the disease were not only ineffective but dangerous. The theory of the four humours, based on the idea that the human body was governed by four basic fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, dominated medieval medical thought. According to this theory, illnesses were caused by imbalances in these humours, and the treatments focused on restoring harmony through methods like bloodletting, purging, and the use of medicinal herbs. When the Black Death arrived, doctors and healers had no real understanding of what caused the disease or how it spread. Theories about its origin varied widely. Some believed it was a divine punishment for humanity's sins, while others thought it was caused by bad air or miasma, a poisonous vapour that supposedly emanated from rotting matter. This miasmic theory led to the widespread use of pestilential fragrances, such as perfumes, to ward off the supposed bad air. However, these measures had little effect on the spread of the plague. In the face of such a devastating disease, the medical profession found itself powerless. The medical community was divided on how to treat the sick, and many treatments, like bloodletting, actually made things worse by weakening the patient's already fragile constitutions. Some doctors prescribed purging the body with strong laxatives, while others relied on herbal remedies, many of which were either ineffective or outright harmful. In some cases, doctors recommended a combination of remedies, such as bathing in rose water or drinking a mixture of wine and vinegar, but none of these offered any real hope of salvation. Despite their best efforts, medieval doctors were unable to stem the tide of death. Hospitals were overwhelmed with sick patients, and there was little distinction between the roles of physicians, surgeons, and barbers. Many barbers at the time were also called upon to perform surgery or administer administer basic medical treatments. The healthcare system, such as it was, could do little to prevent the rampant spread of the disease. The question then is, how did the medieval population respond to such an unprecedented catastrophe? Faced with death on an unimaginable scale, people turned to a variety of coping mechanisms. Some sought solace in religion, praying for divine intervention, while others blamed minority groups such as Jews for allegedly causing the plague. This scapegoating led to widespread violence against Jewish communities, who were often accused of poisoning wells and causing the disease. Entire Jewish populations were massacred or expelled from cities in an effort to rid the land of the supposed plague bringers. Social upheaval was another consequence of the Black Death. Entire communities were ravaged, and with so many people dead, the fabric of society began to unravel. Economic instability grew as labour shortages led to the rise of wages, which in turn resulted in class tensions. The nobility struggled to maintain control over their lands and peasants, who now demanded higher pay for their work and better conditions. The very structure of medieval society was beginning to crack, and it would never be the same again. The Black Death also had an immense psychological impact on the survivors. With death so widespread, many people lived in constant fear, believing that the plague could strike at any moment. Survivors were left to grapple with the trauma of losing family, friends, and entire communities. The plague led to a growing sense of fatalism in medieval society, with the idea that life was fleeting and death could come at any time, becoming more deeply ingrained in the collective psyche. The medieval response to the Black Death highlighted the stark limitations of medical knowledge and the inability of society to effectively address such a widespread crisis. Yet despite the failure of medieval medicine, the plague forced Europe to adapt in ways that would shape future developments in science, medicine, and social structures. As the Black Death raged across Europe, its terrifying spread forced people to look for ways to prevent the disease from taking more lives. While medical knowledge was woefully inadequate and many of the treatments failed, the crisis gave rise to early attempts at what we might now recognise as public health measures. These efforts were rudimentary and often based on superstition, but they marked the beginning of a shift in how disease and hygiene were understood, which would ultimately lay the foundation for modern public health systems. One of the earliest and most widespread measures taken to combat the plague was the imposition of quarantines. The concept of quarantine originated in the Italian port city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik. In 1300, when authorities ordered that ships arriving from plague-infested areas be isolated for 40 days before passengers and crew were allowed to disembark. This period of isolation was known as a quaranta, Italian for 40, and it was designed to prevent infected individuals from spreading the disease to others. Though the scientific understanding of how diseases spread was non-existent, the practice of isolation began to curb the movement of the disease in some regions. It also helped form the basis of future public health policies in Europe. In addition to quarantines, medieval authorities often resorted to the burning of infected clothing, bedding, and homes. While this practice had limited effectiveness in preventing the spread of the plague, it was seen as a way to cleanse the infected environment and stop the disease from spreading further. The practice of destroying contaminated materials was a primitive form of sanitation, though it lacked any real scientific understanding of the role that bacteria or viruses played in transmission. In the wake of the Black Death, a growing awareness of the importance of hygiene began to take root. This shift was gradual, and many of the practices that were put in place were based on the idea of purification rather than medical science. People were urged to bathe regularly and to maintain clean living environments, although the concept of germs or bacteria was not yet understood. In some cases, authorities ordered the cleaning of streets and public spaces and the removal of waste from urban areas, though this was often more about preventing the bad air or miasma that was believed to cause disease rather than addressing the true underlying causes. Some cities, particularly in Italy, took steps to protect public health by regulating the conditions in which food was prepared and sold. This was part of a broader effort to improve sanitation and reduce the risk of disease. While these early public health measures were far from perfect, they marked a significant shift in thinking about how disease could be controlled. The lessons learned from the Black Death, though rudimentary, would eventually form the foundation of modern public health systems in Europe. The role of religion in dealing with the plague was also significant. As the Black Death unfolded, many believed it was a divine punishment for sin, and clergy urged people to repent and pray for mercy. The religious response to the plague was one of both fear and hope, fear of divine retribution and hope for deliverance through repentance and prayer. The religious context led to the rise of certain rituals designed to ward off the disease. Some individuals would carry amulets, while others would engage in processions or flagellations, self-inflicted punishments, to appease God. These religious practices were, of course, largely ineffective in stopping the plague, but they served as an emotional outlet for a society gripped by fear and uncertainty. As the plague swept through Europe, many people turned to religious leaders for comfort and guidance, often in the hope that divine intervention would halt the epidemic. But the ultimate failure of these religious practices to stop the plague contributed to a growing sense of disillusionment with the church in some areas. The failure of the clergy to provide a solution to the plague led some to question the power and authority of religious institutions, sowing seeds of doubt that would later contribute to the Reformation. While the medieval responses to the Black Death were often misguided and based on superstition, they set the stage for later developments in medicine and public health. The Black Death also sparked an interest in the study of disease, which would eventually lead to more scientific investigations into the causes of epidemics. Although the understanding of disease causation would not advance significantly until the 19th century with the advent of germ theory, the ideas of isolation and quarantine, as well as the emphasis on hygiene, would continue to evolve. Medieval responses to the Black Death were rudimentary, but they laid the groundwork for more systematic public health measures that would emerge in later centuries. These early efforts at disease control, while based on limited knowledge, signalled the beginning of a shift in how people understood and approached illness. They marked a slow and gradual move away from supernatural explanations for disease toward more practical, albeit flawed, measures aimed at containing outbreaks. Despite the failure of medieval medicine and the limited understanding of how the plague spread, one of the most lasting effects of the Black Death was the deep impact it had on Europe's collective psyche. The trauma of witnessing entire communities wiped out and the helplessness in the face of such a devastating disease reshaped the way people viewed life, death, and illness. The impact of the Black Death was not just medical, it was social, psychological, and cultural, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Europe. As the Black Death eventually subsided, it left in its wake not only millions of dead, but also a transformed European society. The plague was more than just a deadly disease. It was a catalyst for profound changes in many aspects of life, including medical practices, social structures, and religious beliefs. While the immediate aftermath was filled with grief and confusion, the long-term consequences of the Black Death would pave the way for the evolution of modern medicine and the way society approached public health. In the aftermath of the plague, medieval Europe faced significant social and economic upheaval. With a third of the population dead, there was a sharp decline in the workforce which led to labour shortages. This, in turn, had a profound impact on the economic landscape. Wages rose as peasants and labourers were in short supply, and the social hierarchy began to shift. The traditional feudal system, which relied on a large subjugated peasant class, prevented. Although medieval medicine remained largely ineffective in combating the plague, it laid the groundwork for future advancements. The idea of quarantine, which had been employed in some places during the Black Death, became an important tool in later epidemics. Quarantine laws were formalised, and isolation became a key strategy in dealing with infectious diseases. Another important shift in the aftermath of the Black Death was the growing importance of hygiene and sanitation. Though the medieval understanding of disease transmission was still primitive, the plague made it clear that unclean living conditions could exacerbate the spread of disease. Cities and towns began to implement more rigorous cleaning measures, such as removing waste and creating more hygienic living spaces. These early efforts at improving public sanitation were the precursors to the more modern public health initiatives that would emerge in later centuries. In terms of medical knowledge, the Black Death spurred some of the most significant changes in medieval thought. The devastation of the plague prompted a re-examination of the medical practices of the time. Doctors began to look for new ways to prevent and treat diseases, and medical scholars started to question the accepted theories of disease. This curiosity and skepticism would eventually lead to the scientific revolution and the birth of modern medicine. One of the most significant developments was the rise of the Renaissance in the late 15th century, which brought with it an explosion of interest in science, anatomy, and empirical observation. The Renaissance marked a shift away from purely theological explanations for disease and death and toward a more scientific, evidence-based approach. This period saw the dissection of human bodies, which had previously been taboo, and the publication of medical texts that laid the foundations for the study of anatomy and physiology. The medical profession also began to evolve during this time. Physicians, who had once been trained in universities and had little practical experience, began to learn from actual cases and incorporate more hands-on knowledge into their practice. The rise of pharmacies and the study of herbal remedies were also part of this transformation, as medical practitioners sought new ways to treat illnesses. However, despite the growth of medical knowledge, the field was still rudimentary by modern standards, and the understanding of diseases like the plague remained limited. One of the most profound impacts of the Black Death was its effect on the relationship between the Church and the people. During the plague, many turned to religion for answers, seeking divine intervention or protection. But the failure of the Church to offer a solution to the plague led to growing disillusionment. People began to question the authority of religious institutions and sought answers from sources outside of the Church. This shift in thinking would contribute to the weakening of the Church's influence in Europe and set the stage for the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. The Black Death also had lasting cultural effects. With so much death and destruction, many people began to view life and death in a more fatalistic way. Art, literature, and philosophy from this period often reflected a preoccupation with mortality and the transience of life. The Dance of Death motif, which appeared in art and literature, illustrated the inevitability of death, regardless of one's status or wealth. This shift in cultural attitudes was a response to the immense suffering and loss caused by the plague, and was emblematic of a society grappling with its own mortality. In a broader sense, the plague changed how people viewed medicine. The collapse of medieval medicine in the face of such a devastating epidemic highlighted the inadequacies of the time and created the desire for a better understanding of health, disease, and the human body. This desire for knowledge led to the growth of medical schools, the spread of new ideas, and the eventual establishment of public health systems. Though medieval medicine could not stop the Black Death, the aftermath of the plague set in motion changes that would eventually lead to a more scientifically informed and systematic approach to health. The development of medical knowledge during the Renaissance, the rise of public health initiatives, and the ongoing exploration of disease transmission and medicine in the centuries to come. Medieval warfare was defined by its raw brutality. Battles were often fought with rudimentary weapons, with knights and foot soldiers clashing in hand-to-hand combat. Unlike the organised, technologically advanced armies of today, medieval soldiers fought in chaotic and violent confrontations, where tactics were often more about brute strength and endurance than strategy and precision. The experience of battle in the Middle Ages was nothing short of horrific, and the physical toll it took on those involved was immense. The most iconic image of medieval warfare is that of the knight in shining armour, but the reality was far grimmer. Knights, though they enjoyed noble status, were often just as vulnerable to injury and death as their common foot soldiers. The armour they wore, which has come to symbolise chivalric ideals, was heavy and cumbersome, offering limited protection against weapons designed to pierce through it. Swords, maces and axes were the main weapons of the battlefield, and they were often used with savage force. The brutality of medieval warfare was not just about the weapons used, but also the tactics employed. Armies often fought in close formations, charging at one another in a frenzy. The noise of clashing steel, the screams of the wounded, and the smell of blood and sweat filled the air. The battlefield was a place where survival was uncertain and death could come in an instant. There was no room for mercy or hesitation. Every soldier was fighting for their life, and the outcome of the battle often depended on who could outlast the other in sheer willpower. The use of cavalry was another defining feature of medieval warfare. Mounted knights would often charge into battle, using their speed and mobility to break enemy lines. The weight and force of a knight on horseback wielding a lance or sword was enough to crush an opponent's defences. However, the role of the knight in battle was not just about brute force. It was also deeply symbolic. The knight, as a member of the warrior class, was bound by a code of honour and chivalry which dictated how they should conduct themselves in battle. But even in the heat of battle, the concept of chivalry would often be put to the test. While knights were expected to show bravery and honour on the battlefield, medieval warfare was often far from noble. The aim was not just to defeat the enemy, but to annihilate them. Once a battle was won, the victors would often engage in the practice of looting, pillaging, and massacring the survivors. Towns and the villages were ransacked, and prisoners were often executed on the spot. The brutality of war was not limited to the battlefield. It extended to the treatment of civilians who were often caught in the crossfire of sieges and raids. The toll that medieval warfare took on society was immense. Wars were costly, both in terms of human lives and resources. The destruction of villages and towns, the loss of crops and livestock, and the disruption of trade and commerce all had far-reaching consequences. The constant state of conflict and instability left little room for social or economic development, and many regions of Europe were locked in cycles of violence that lasted for centuries. Yet despite the chaos and bloodshed, medieval warfare also had a concept of chivalry that sought to bring some measure of order and honour to the violent world of battle. The ideals of chivalry, which emphasised bravery, loyalty and respect for women and the weak, became central to the identity of the knightly class. These ideals, disregarded on the battlefield, helped shape the social fabric of medieval Europe, and the idea of the knight as a noble and honourable figure became ingrained in the collective consciousness. But were the ideals of chivalry just a facade to justify the brutality of warfare? Or did they reflect a genuine attempt to bring honour to a society defined by violence and conflict? How did the rise of chivalry influence the development of medieval society, and what role did it play in shaping the future of European warfare? The rise of chivalry in medieval Europe was, in many ways, an attempt to bring some sense of order and nobility to a world rife with violence and chaos. The chivalric code, though often idealised, was a set of principles that governed the conduct of knights and other members of the warrior class. This code, which emphasised bravery, loyalty, respect for women and protection of the weak, sought to bring honour to an otherwise brutal and unforgiving society. Chivalry was first and foremost a code of conduct for knights, who were considered the highest and most noble of warriors. As knights were often the leaders in medieval armies, the chivalric code was not just about individual behaviour, it was about how knights should conduct themselves on the battlefield, in the courts, and in their interactions with others. The chivalric code was deeply influenced by the ideals of Christian morality, and it was intertwined with the teachings of the Church. A knight was expected to serve God, defend the Christian faith, and protect the innocent, especially women, children, and the poor. The most famous of the chivalric virtues was courtesy, which included the respectful treatment of women, the elderly, and those of lower social status. The knight was seen as a protector, not just in battle, but in society at large. Knights were expected to uphold justice, protect the oppressed, and behave with humility and honour. The idea of noble warfare was central to the chivalric code. Battles, while brutal and bloody, were meant to be fought for just causes, whether that was defending one's lord, the church, or the common people. A knight was supposed to engage in combat only when necessary, and it was expected that they would fight with honour, avoiding treachery or deceit. However, the practical application of chivalry was often far from ideal. While the code promoted noble ideals, medieval warfare was inherently brutal, and knights were frequently involved in acts of violence and destruction that violated the principles of the code. The reality of medieval warfare was not as chivalric as the tales of knights and their noble deeds would suggest. While knights were trained in the art of combat, they were also part of a violent hierarchical system in which power was often maintained through force. In this context, the chivalric code, while promoting honour and virtue, was sometimes used as a tool to legitimise violence and war. One of the key contradictions of chivalry was the concept of courtly love. This idealised form of love, which was often romanticised in medieval literature, portrayed knights as devoted lovers who performed heroic deeds to win the favour of a lady. Courtly love was not necessarily about marriage or physical relationships, but was an expression of the knight's loyalty and devotion to a lady, often one who was married to another man or of higher status. While the concept of courtly love was deeply romanticised, it also reflected the complex power dynamics of medieval society. Women, who were often seen as the property of their husbands or fathers, were placed on a pedestal in chivalric literature, but their actual roles in society were restricted. Knights, in their devotion to ladies, could gain honour and reputation, but the idealised nature of this love rarely translated into true gender equality. Chivalry also played a significant role in the development of feudal society. The feudal system was based on a hierarchy of lords and vassals, and knights were typically vassals who swore loyalty to their lords in exchange for land and protection. The relationship between a knight and his lord was governed by a mutual obligation of loyalty, military service and honour. Knights were expected to fight in their lord's battles, defend their lands, and serve as protectors of the realm. In return, they were given land and titles, as well as the status that came with being part of the knightly class. This system of feudalism created a rigid social order, in which the code of chivalry helped reinforce the power dynamics between the aristocracy and the lower classes. Despite the contradictions between the ideals of chivalry and the reality of medieval warfare, the code had a profound impact on European culture. The chivalric ideals of honour, loyalty and bravery became central to the identity of the medieval knight, and these principles were reflected in the literature, art and philosophy of the time. Epic tales of knights, such as the stories of King Arthur and his Round Table, portrayed knights as heroic figures who embarked on quests to defend the weak, uphold justice and seek honour. These stories, though often exaggerated and romanticised, helped to establish the knight as the quintessential symbol of medieval chivalry. The concept of chivalry continued to evolve over time, but it was never fully realised in the way that the code's architects had hoped. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, and the advent of gunpowder and firearms, the role of the knight began to change. Warfare became more focused on strategy, artillery and military tactics, and the age of the armoured knight gradually came to an end. However, the ideals of chivalry continued to influence European culture, especially in literature and art, where knights remained figures of nobility. In the modern world, the legacy of chivalry lives on in the form of the modern emphasise identity and duty. The code of conduct for soldiers, whether in times of war or peace, can be traced back to the chivalric traditions of the Middle Ages. The idea of protecting the innocent, upholding justice and acting with honour is still a central tenet of military service today. The question that remains is, to what extent did chivalry serve as a tool for the perpetuation of medieval violence and social inequality? Was the chivalric code truly a noble ideal, or was it simply a way to justify the violence and inequality of medieval society? And in what ways does the legacy of chivalry continue to shape our understanding of honour, warfare and duty in the modern world? As the medieval world gave way to the early modern period, the ideals of chivalry continued to echo through the corridors of European history. While the structure of warfare evolved with the introduction of gunpowder and firearms, the core concepts of chivalric honour, loyalty and bravery persisted, influencing not only the development of military ethics, but also the broader cultural and social fabric of Europe. The legacy of chivalry is not just confined to medieval tales of knights and damsels, it extends far beyond the Middle Ages influencing both the military traditions and cultural norms that would emerge in later centuries. Chivalry, though it was initially a code governing knights, gradually influenced the broader idea of military conduct. Even as the feudal system crumbled and the role of knights shifted in the wake of firearms and centralized armies, the underlying principles of chivalry were woven into the fabric of military ethos. Early modern armies, though different in structure and technology, still carried the weight of these medieval ideals. In fact, the military codes of conduct, which emphasize bravery in battle, loyalty to the king, and protection of the weak, all found their origins in the chivalric tradition. Even as tactics and weaponry shifted, the idea of fighting with honour remained central to military ideology. One of the most notable ways in which chivalry's legacy persisted was in the concept of just war. The chivalric code had long dictated that warfare should only be waged for just causes, whether to defend one's realm, protect the innocent, or uphold justice. This idea of a just war became a guiding principle for many of the wars that would follow in the early modern period. The notion that knights fought for noble causes, even as they engaged in brutal violence, laid the groundwork for discussions of military ethics in later centuries. The idea that war should have a moral framework, that combatants should fight with restraint and purpose, would be further developed during the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. At the same time, the ideals of chivalry became increasingly romanticised in European literature and art. The stories of King Arthur, Charlemagne, and other legendary knights became symbols of an idealised past, one in which warriors fought for honour and virtue, rather than for political power or material gain. These tales of heroism, loyalty, and courtly love were not just entertainment. They were meant to inspire future generations and to keep alive the values that chivalry represented. In literature, the knightly code continued to be depicted as a model of ideal behaviour, one that transcended the grim realities of medieval warfare. In modern times, the influence of chivalry can still be seen in the way we view warfare and honour. The concept of the gentleman soldier, a soldier who behaves with dignity, respects the rights of prisoners, and fights for a cause greater than personal gain, can trace its origins back to the chivalric ideals. The legacy of knights, who are expected to behave with courtesy and fairness even in battle, continues to shape the ethical frameworks that govern modern armed forces. In fact, many of the ethical codes followed by contemporary military institutions, such as the Geneva Conventions, which prohibit the targeting of civilians and the mistreatment of prisoners, echo the spirit of chivalry. Furthermore, the language of chivalry has permeated modern notions of masculinity, leadership, and nobility. The romanticised image of the knight as a figure of honour and virtue persists in cultural representations of heroism. From literature to film, the knight continues to be a symbol of courage, loyalty, and righteousness. These values, while often idealised, still resonate in modern depictions of military leaders, superheroes, and even corporate leaders who are portrayed as champions, fighting for the greater good. However, the legacy of chivalry also prompts us to question the tension between its noble ideals and the often brutal realities of war. While the chivalric code sought to impose a moral structure on warfare, medieval battles were not fought according to these ideals. The knightly class, despite their adherence to the code, often engaged in violent conquests, looting, and destruction. The reality of medieval warfare was messy, filled with contradictions and ethical dilemmas that the chivalric code could not always resolve. In modern times, we continue to struggle with these contradictions. How do we reconcile the ideals of honour and justice with the brutal nature of war? In considering the legacy of chivalry, it is important to recognise that it was not just a code for warriors, but also a reflection of the values of medieval society. Chivalry was intertwined with the idea of nobility and the feudal system. It was a reflection of the hierarchy that placed knights at the top, with clear divisions between those who fought, those who farmed, and those who prayed. The ideals of chivalry were also a tool of social control, reinforcing the power of the aristocracy by setting standards of behaviour that reinforced their privileged status. In the modern world, where the traditional roles of knights and nobility have largely faded, the legacy of chivalry is more symbolic than practical, yet it still shapes the way we think about war, honour, and leadership. It continues to inform our cultural myths and the moral frameworks we use to evaluate the actions of leaders and soldiers. The enduring presence of chivalric ideals reminds us that while warfare may evolve in its methods and technologies, the core values of bravery, loyalty, and honour continue to resonate in our collective consciousness. So as we look at the legacy of medieval chivalry, we must ask ourselves, how does the romanticised view of the knight still influence our perception of heroism and warfare today? And can we ever truly separate the ideals of chivalry from the violent history it helped to shape?